We've done Sega, we've done Capcom, and both of those have been enjoyable. Certainly they featured plenty of interesting games to look at. But Konami, well, they might be the top classic game company on the Specky for various reasons. You've got the big official arcade ports, of course. A lot of them are by Ocean Software, and there's some very important games in there. You've also got the unofficial ports, of which there are a frankly ridiculous amount, and some of them were pretty big titles as well. You've even got a connection of sorts between Konami and the makers of the Spectrum, at least for a company they're highly associated with, that goes all the way back to the very beginning of the computer. It's high time then that we took a look at the official Konami arcade ports on the system. While not every game here is good, well, generally we're in safe hands. And we ought to look at some of the biggest unofficial ones too. Without them the picture would be a little incomplete. Let us begin. We start right in the early years of the system. The year is 1983, and we've got some games published by Sinclair Research themselves. Now, these games aren't actually Konami ones, mainly they're Hudson Soft titles, ported from the MSX. However, with Hudson and Konami being so close to each other, and with these games coming from a platform that Konami was kind of dominant on, I don't know, they fit quite comfortably in here, and they're certainly titles worth covering. Some of them have an important part to play in a couple of very important game series, after all, such as the very first one we're looking at, for example. Most of these titles were developed by a rather obscure company called Kuma, or at least they were ported over from that company's MSX versions of games that originally appeared on platforms like the Sharp X1 and PC-88. Eric and the Floaters, as a title, may not sound immediately familiar, but one look at the game and chances are you'll know what this one is straight away. Yes, it's Bomberman, a port over from the MSX version of the game that originally appeared on various Japanese computers. Bomberman itself didn't really hit it big until 1985 when it was converted over to the Famicom, so what we have here is a curious mix of European and Japanese computer game history indeed, from 2 years before that. Here on the Specky, our guy certainly doesn't look like a regular Bomberman. In fact, he looks more like a farmer who's decided to deal with pests in a somewhat extreme fashion. By and large, the game here plays the same. Lay bombs to kill enemies and also destroy blocks. Although there is one large difference, seeing as here, in Floaters, you can actually travel over the bombs you place, meaning that you can't really trap enemies with them, and the game's more about timing a bomb correctly so that it kills them. Or, often, just getting lucky with their movement. In any case, it is still Bomberman, and very good indeed, a popular title in the system's early days. Much more obscure, but still somewhat part of an important series, is Bubble Buster, which is a version of a game known as Cannonball. Again, this should be familiar quickly. This game here provided the main inspiration for the almighty Pan, and it's quite a cool thing to see such an early edition of the game running on my beloved Specky. As in Pan, you burst the bubbles until they disappear using a hook that you fire upwards. This certainly gets hard quite sharpish as the bubbles get smaller and more plentiful, and the movement here isn't exactly as smooth as in the most famous title either. Still, it's quite an addictive game to play, just like Pan. I can definitely imagine this one being very cool in 1983. However, the absolute best game from this bunch isn't in question. Eric and the Floaters and Bubble Buster are decent enough, but Stop the Express is a confirmed Specky great, certainly one of the best looking early Specky titles, and one of the best playing too. In this conversion from the X1, you start by running on top of the train, avoiding the knives chucked by the red men giving chase and throwing birds at them that you catch. In the second stage, inside the train, you can jump kick these murderous Liverpool fans as they come at you, although you've always got to watch where you're jumping. This game plays so fast and is just so addictive, not to mention pretty cool looking, and through most of the computer's commercial existence, it was regarded as one of the system's greatest ever games. Your Sinclair, for example, placed it 4th in their all-time top 100. It's really a shame that this game's largely unknown outside of the Specky. There's no big arcade port here or anything, only a later Famicom game called Challenger that's a fair bit different and never left Japan. This is the sort of game that could easily have been an arcade smash if it had been given the chance, and weirdly enough, is probably most famous right here on the Spectrum. There's a couple of other games too to go through, just for completion mainly. Driller Tanks here is a bit of an intriguing one where you have to burrow your way through the land in order to get to enemies, but not too much as you have to stop them tunnelling through the foundations of the building above. It's quite a tricky one and it didn't altogether grab me, but it certainly fits in with the other three. Frog Shooter and Vegetable Crash are less successful. One of these is a tunnel game that's somewhat similar to Zoom 909, but not one that I could get with at all, even if it looks okay for the time. And the other is a kind of bog-standard Galaxian clone, the sort of thing you can find a lot of on the system. So that about wraps it up for these games. Again, even if they're not necessarily by Konami, they're rather close and, well, this video's as good a time to take a look at them as any really, as I'm not sure when else I would do such a thing. Right, let's look at some official Konami titles. And yes, that means going back to the almighty Ocean Software. These games started to appear in 1985, and almost all of Ocean's Konami ports were released through the Imagine label, which they used for most of their arcade ports from companies like SNK and what have you. By and large, a fairly set group of Ocean's Dungeoneers were assigned to work on these titles, and they included some pretty talented folk. Not least among them being the legend, that is Jonathan Joffa Smith. Most of the games we're going to be looking at here were pretty bloody high quality titles as a result, the sort of classics that should be thoroughly championed on the system. Mind you, even here, there are a couple of total stinkers. Ping Pong's a pretty good one to start off with. As you'll see, Imagine didn't necessarily do games out of Konami's top drawer all the time. You do get gems like this one that aren't necessarily the most famous arcades, but they're pretty damn good on here. Ping Pong is probably most famous for the excellent theme song and Joffa Smith's plip-plop sound routine that does some quite wild things with the 48k beeper. But Doug Byrne's conversion is also really good once you get to grips with playing it, figuring out when you should switch the racket and the best shots and so on. It certainly rewards spending time with it, as you do feel yourself getting better quite quickly. And being that Joffa's involved, you can expect a few big noises from the beeper along the way. Definitely a recommended one. Speaking of Joffa, Hypersports is one that he's wholly at the helm of, doing just about everything. Obviously I've covered this and other Joffa-centric ports that we're going to see in the video that's all about him, but as was often the case with him, this is quite simply a fantastic conversion. All the events are here, the graphics are bright and wonderful for the 1985 Spectrum, and it's chock full of the usual Joffa quirks and personality. Of all the various joystick smashing athletics games you can find on the Specky, this is pretty easily the best of the lot, even beating out the almighty Daley Thompson's Decathlon. Even with events like the Vault being quite viciously difficult, this is an absolute classic. The Specky version of Yie Ar Kung-Fu is another gem. Actually, most of the micro versions of this one are pretty good really. You get perfectly okay graphics for the system here, but the important thing is that the fast-paced arcade action is thoroughly retained, the controls are utterly natural to grasp, and it gives you plenty to be getting on with. The game starts you off pretty easy at first, but it does certainly get harder as you go from loop to loop. There's also nice in-game music on the 1 to 8K version. You can't go wrong at all with this one, and the original Yie Ar Kung-Fu is probably a good shout for being the Spectrum's best one-on-one fighting game. Still, although we've started strongly, again, they're not all good here. Next are a couple of kind of weird ones released by Imagine, simply called Konami's Golf and Konami's Tennis. These aren't ports from the arcade at all, and instead are ports of a couple of pretty basic Konami MSX games. Neither of these stand out at all, and in fact the golf game is pretty actively dreadful, one that even manages to screw up the usually dead simple power bar golf game controls. The tennis game is actually one that I had growing up, and alas, revisiting it wasn't a particularly pleasant experience. There's not much fun to be had here either. There is no reason why you'd load these up ahead of something like Leaderboard or Matchpoint, and frankly both of these games seem pointless, aside from there perhaps being some unwritten law in those days that every studio must have a generic golf and tennis game, and Konami's branding being added on in the hope of shifting a few more copies. Happily, we're back with Joffre again, and it's the weird and wonderful Mikie. Again, not exactly one of Konami's most famous arcades, and in fact pretty far from their best one, but the kooky and rather humorous game with its heart-grabbing hero, perpetually infuriated teachers, and Beatles aping music is given a wonderful treatment here on the Spectrum. As with the other Joffre arcade ports, not only will you not find anything really missing from the arcade, but you will find the little quirks that ended up making the games kind of his own, not to mention absolutely tip-top technical standard. An excellent game for sure. In fact, I would say that this arcade port is one that I greatly prefer over the original arcade. Still, even with the great work from Joffre that we've seen, there is one port where he excelled even himself. The one that is, for me, his pinnacle. Green Beret is not only the best Joffre game, not only the best game in this video, for me it is the absolute best ZX Spectrum arcade port there ever was. No contest. This one is absolutely flawless, and I wouldn't use that word lightly. It was my number 2 all-time Specky game for a good reason. Green Beret is just so intense, enemies pouring out at you from seemingly all angles, but even if you've only got a knife to hand most of the time, it's still a very capable weapon for dealing with them. You've just always got to be looking out for the various threats, particularly the jumping folks, always thinking on the fly, and always trying to move forward. Everything here is just so razor sharp, and it constantly keeps you coming back for more goes. I love it. I suppose the only other thing you could wish for with this one is some in-game music, something that Joffre regretted not being able to include as there simply wasn't enough memory left to do it. But what a game this is, as good as arcade ports get on the ZX Spectrum. And of course we go from the system's best port to one of the worst ones. Even here in a section based on Ocean's Imagine label we do run into a disaster. Now, Yie Ar Kung-Fu 2 itself wasn't a particularly popular sequel. It was originally on the MSX, and I'm not sure if people really cared for the game becoming more of a beat-em-up in the IOM Kung-Fu vein, and how the series turned so quickly from being an innovator into just a follower. But still, you wouldn't expect this port to be screwed up so badly. But it happened. Just look at this wretched, broken excuse for a port. What on earth happened? Did someone have to knock this up in days as a desperation job, or was it just always like this? The Yie Ar Kung-Fu 2 port is bad on all platforms, but particularly here on the Spectrum, the broken controls, complete lack of difficulty, and absolutely grotesque graphics really combine for an all-time stinker, and a game that was seemingly sent out to die in obscurity. It's telling that only one magazine even bothered to review it, considering the popularity of the first game. It's a complete and total mess, right down with some of the awful ports that we're going to see later. The Imagine label took a bit of a break from Konami games, but returned in 1988 with two more. The first one here, WEC Le Mans, is a very good one that we actually covered a bit in our previous video on Ocean licenses. This conversion here by Mike Lamb is one of the best racing games you'll find on the Specky. We've got nice full graphics, some pretty good speed, and it all controls nicely too. A fine conversion from one of Ocean's best coders, and again, it's a bit of a surprise that it never got a shot on 16-bit consoles or computers. The final Imagine Konami game is Typhoon, and it's another very good one. What we have here is a top-down shoot-em-up that's probably better known as Ajax, the name it went by in the arcades. This is a very action-packed shooter that's somewhat in the Xevious vein, although with a few neat little tweaks such as the very cool dive bomb in first stage and what have you. A pretty cool shmup indeed, particularly for the venerable Specky, and the music is terrific too. But hey, it's Ocean, what do you expect? To close things off here, we have a selection of Konami arcade games that, for whatever reason, Ocean chose to publish on their regular branding as opposed to the Imagine label. And here too you will find some pretty good ones. Going back to the tried and tested joystick murdering formula, Combat School proved to be a pretty decent hit. It's basically a take on the old-fashioned Daley Thompson routine, only now you're training to be a big old soldier, and there's a little more variety in the way of shooting sections, top-down bits and the like. This one's okay. I find some of the sections to be a bit more of an irritation than others, but it's an okay conversion that's kind of clearly meant to be enjoyed by two players. You know, just so you can really double up on the relentless abuse of competition pros or speedkins or Trevor the Tortoises or whatever you decide to use as your waggle tool. Here's one that's a bit more interesting. Gryzor. Yes, the Spectrum has a version of Contra. Gryzor is what the game was called over here in the arcades, and at this time our badass military men hadn't had to change into robot costumes and become probotectors yet. Anyway, Gryzor here is actually a decent conversion. It looks and plays like the classic, albeit in its arcade form. Some things do get changed up a bit. You actually only get the chance to power up your gun on the first stage, although you do retain your power up after you inevitably die. The game is balls hard, of course, seeing as there are no continues, but you do get both side-scrolling and base stages, which is neat. While the game can be a little bit buggy with music disappearing and the other odd little flaw here and there, it doesn't usually affect the gameplay any. A pretty good port, and a suitably challenging one. Here we have a rather amusing little mess. Yes, it's Track and Field, coming out in 1988, and presumably something that Ocean had to do purely out of contractual obligation or for some other legal reason. After all, they kind of already did the game, only it was Daley Thompson's Decathlon 4 years earlier. Anyway, Track and Field was a special bonus game that can only be found on a compilation called Game Set and Match 2, where it's one of the last titles in a 10-game set. Seeing as it's such a pain to find, you probably know what to expect. This version of the game has clearly been knocked up in no time at all, and is also thoroughly broken. If you qualify in the high jump, the game crashes as it tries to load a 7th event that's quite simply not there, because only 6 were coded. Not many people noticed this dreadful bit of code, which I think was quite possibly the point. Needless to say, you should just go play Daley Thompson's Decathlon if you want to play Track and Field so badly. Now, if you think that the previous game was a bit obscure, well, this last one kind of takes the cake. Here we have a game from Ocean called Road Race. It's a pretty simple game, perhaps a lot more simple than you would expect from them. But then this was actually released on a Your Sinclair cover tape in 1987, presented as a special Easter gift from the studio. It's all yours for the princely sum of 50 pence. The connection to Konami here is that it's actually a stealth port of an MSX game by them called Hyper Rally, which in and of itself is a not very well known pole position-esque title. According to the almighty Games That Weren't, Ocean made plans to port this game to a couple of platforms, but ultimately decided against it due to the game being a bit long in the tooth. It seems like more info at the time was released about a C64 port of this one, but while no version of that game's ever been recovered, this specky version did actually come out, albeit very stealthily indeed. As far as the game goes, well, it's a pretty bad average driving game, but then it is a cover tape title, so hey ho. Now, here's one big difference between Konami and the other big software houses we've covered like Sega and Capcom. At one point they decided that they were going to try and do it all themselves, creating and releasing their own arcade ports to the specky and making a big noise about how they weren't going to be going through labels like Imagine anymore. Now this does kind of make sense, seeing as Konami themselves were pretty proficient at computer games, what with all their experience on platforms like the MSX, where they were pretty much the kings. You wouldn't think it would be much of a leap to go from there to creating these games for the Spectrum, would it? However, this move would prove to be a short-lived and very bad idea that resulted in not much except for 4 really rather poor arcade conversions that were nothing but a disappointment for most of the people who ended up buying them. If we have a little look at this quartet then, perhaps we can figure out just what went wrong. The first release, and probably the best one, was a version of Jailbreak, and that's not to say that this port is any good. The graphics aren't too awful, but the almost total lack of sound was a big disappointment, particularly at the time when this game was released, and on the whole this is way more unfair than the arcade, which is saying a lot seeing as that game is hard as nails. What you kind of have here is a game that's a lot like Green Beret, but also a hell of a lot worse in every department, especially when it comes to Spectrum ports. The rather sticky controls and enemy placements that you can't even really learn because of the random factor just makes the whole thing a pain, and you're a much better gamer than I am if you can get anywhere close to completing the first bloody level of this one. Just a completely unappealing game, quite frankly. Next up we have a package that's quite infamous, Nemesis The Final Challenge, or Gradius as it's mostly known by. This was a very hotly anticipated arcade port indeed. While the MSX wasn't a popular platform in the UK, we'd heard how good this game was on there. The magazines certainly bigged it up and we expected something similar, especially when looking at the screenshots in the mags filled with big sprites and so on. But that's not really what we got. Here we got a pretty cut down game that doesn't do much of anything impressive at all graphically, and it controls like a dog with collision detection that's hideously naff, even for the specky where such things can be a bit of an issue. It certainly wasn't anything like the screenshots in mags like Sinclair User, that's for sure. It is a curious thing really. People have wondered whether the version shown in said screenshots was one that existed at all. Were these shots just plain doctored? Or was there indeed a version of the game that had all these sprites? My feeling is that there was, if not a complete one. I wonder if the original plan was for this to be a 1 to 8K game only, which would have given it the same memory as MSX Gradius, and then a decision was made that the game should be playable on all spectrums, meaning that a lot of things just had to be cut in order to save memory. Perhaps that's what happened here. In any case, this is another very disappointing conversion, and certainly not the standard people expected when Konami announced that they were going to go solo. And still, it got worse. Here's Jackal, and holy hell do I wish it wasn't here at all. Jackal is such a fine game, a satisfying game where you happily run goons over, rescue hostages and blow up installations. You can't knock it back. And then you get this version and it may as well just be some different game, because a child may have done better trying to type a version of it in. This is diabolical. The Jeep doesn't even move properly, there's no diagonal shots, hitting anything is a nightmare, the title screen music is a joke. Nothing here is good at all. A wretched port of a coin-op that is absolutely one of the worst we'll see in this video. Who on earth were Konami getting to do these? You almost wonder if they'd called up Canvas Software or something like that, judging by what's going on with these ports. A complete embarrassment. The final port, or rather the final insult here, is Salamander. You know, Life Force. And yeah, we've kinda got the same sort of issues here as we had on Nemesis. There is more detail in the graphics at least, but the game's played in a postage stamp. This isn't the sort of thing people wanted to see on the Specky in 1988, it must be said. The game itself is highly frustrating, even for a Gradius type game. The difficulty certainly isn't good here at all, with a lot of lives lost simply through the game's annoying lack of bullets and other such bullshit. And once again we have an absolutely wretched bit of music that no one could abide listening to for any more than a few seconds. This again is just not worth bothering with. But the real kick in the teeth here probably comes when you look at Salamander on the C64, which was handled by Imagine. On the C64, Salamander is an all-time great port, a smashing version of the arcade loved by everyone that's pretty much got everything you could want. On the Spectrum, well, it's this pile of shit. If ever there was a big old stick sitting right there for Commodore owners to bash Specky fans around the head with, it's this game right here. Thank heavens it's the end of this whole dire Konami experiment. What about games that were supposed to see the light of day, but never came out for whatever reason? There's a few intriguing tidbits here, including one that does take us down a bit of a software rabbit hole, so they are worth mentioning. Some C64 fans might be wondering why we didn't see any mention of Comic Bakery in the Imagine section. That's one that people generally enjoy on the system, after all. However, while a Spectrum version of Comic Bakery was advertised, it never actually came out, nor is there much mention of it beyond advertising. Other than that, very little is known about how a Specky version progressed, really. The short-lived Konami experiment did also produce some other names. Iron Horse was advertised as being amongst Konami's planned releases, and there does exist a screenshot of the title screen. But again, despite another full-page ad in a mag, this one didn't come out. Nor did Super Basketball, which was also mentioned when Konami revealed their plans. There were also apparently plans to release a version of Vulcan Venture on the ZX Spectrum. In other words, Gradius 2. I suppose, considering the quality of both Nemesis and Salamander, that we should be thankful this one didn't happen. Finally, we do have something intriguing. Gyruss. What's odd about this one then? Well, the software house behind it might be an odd one. It's Parker Software, an American studio. This and other games by Parker were mooted for release in around 1984 or so, and they'd have largely been for the Timex Sinclair 2068, Sinclair's failed second attempt to break America that was based off the Specky, although not very compatible with it. These games would have been released as ROM cartridges, and there seemingly were plans to release this and other games in the UK too. You can get a few cartridge games for the Specky after all, mainly early Ultimate games. Proposed games included this one, Montezuma's Revenge, the Nintendo Popeye game, Unofficial Q*bert, the Star Wars Arcade, and Return of the Jedi Death Star Battle. Death Star Battle and Montezuma's Revenge, known as Panama Joe, did get tape releases on the Specky, but a fair few of the other games like Gyruss just didn't come out at all. Happily, Gyruss and most of the other titles have been recovered, and you can see it in action here. As you can see, it's actually not too bad a conversion. It moves smoothly and features most of the things that you would expect, even if the graphics perhaps aren't all that hot. Not bad for 1984, to be honest. Kind of a shame that this one and the other Parker conversions didn't make it, as some of them are okay. The reasons as to why these games mostly never came out is kind of straightforward really. The Timex Sinclair 2068 was a flop, and the Interface 2 ROM cartridge port add-on that was required to play these cartridges on the Speccy, well, shockingly that was a flop too, with almost no software aside from 16K Ultimate games and, well, just being a ridiculous idea in general. I mean, as good as Jetpack might be, virtually nobody wanted to buy this add-on for 20 quid and then pay another 15 quid for the cartridge just so they could load it instantly when the tape itself was at most a few pounds. You can chalk the whole thing up as another terrible Sinclair idea, really. Speaking of Ultimate Play the Game, I suppose the other odd thing here is that Gyruss has long been thought of, although never fully confirmed, as a game worked on by Tim and Chris Stamper and sold to Konami in the days before they founded the almighty studio. And it turns out it actually did come to the Spectrum, albeit in a very roundabout and obscure way. Up next, we've got a little look at some of the more famous unofficial versions of Konami games that you can find. This feels appropriate here as there's a ton of these and some of the games are important. Now, while looking at every single one would be a frankly impossible project, these are pretty much the cream of the crop, the ones that people really remember. And unlike a lot of other unofficial arcade clones, this video would kind of feel like it was missing something if they weren't at least mentioned. I've picked out 8 titles here. They represent clones for the games Frogger, Scramble, Amidar, Track and Field, Combat School, and Gradius. So, Frogger first. The Spectrum has a quite frankly ridiculous amount of Frogger clones, especially from back in the system's early days. Everything from commercially released games to ones that you had to type in from a magazine or a book. And yes, a lot of them are very, very bad indeed. However, when it comes to proper Frogger clones from the system's first years, there is one that really stands out from the crowd, and that would be Froggy by DJL Software, DJL standing for David J. Looker, the maker of the port. There are some straightforward reasons as to why this is a good port, of course. Most everything from the arcade is here, which mostly wasn't the case in other Frogger clones. Either that or they tried to change the gameplay up in some terrible way. Others are more subtle. This one might actually let you play for a good few minutes, whereas other Frogger clones are so awful that you can barely make it across the first road. The graphics are perfectly okay for 1983, really, and it's a fun version of the classic arcade. I mean, it may not look like much nowadays, but this is so far ahead of most other contemporary Froggers on the Speccy that it's not even funny. But if you really want to see this game in context, then the almighty Paul Jenkinson of the Spectrum show did do a quite exhaustive Frogger arcade clone rundown in the show's 33rd episode that I've linked to in the description. You can see just how ghastly some of the other Frogger clones are there. Both that video and this game are definitely recommended. While it is not strictly a Frogger clone, I should certainly give a little mention to Beam Software's Horace Goes Skiing. It is a pretty big frickin' title after all, and half of it certainly does use Frogger as a heavy inspiration, when you have to cross the road to grab your skis and then get to the slope, all the while dodging traffic and stopping our weird blue blob hero from getting flattened and having to pay an ambulance fee, presumably to the same ambulance that just ran him over. Horace is a great game, obviously. It's certainly not a strict Frogger clone, what with the skiing half and everything, but it most certainly wouldn't exist without Frogger already being around. Sticking with both Beam Software and another game from the very early days of the Speccy, here's the almighty Penetrator. Yes, it has a title that sounds a bit rude, but it's also by far the best of the Speccy's many, many Scramble clones. Certainly this is the one that always sticks out in people's memory. Is it the iconic title screen that gets drawn in? the wailing shrieks and sirens, the control scheme that's a little bit odd but actually not too bad to get used to. It just has a certain vibe, a very early 80s sort of deal that ushers you into the period, even if you didn't live through it. An excellent little clone, this one. Up next we have the fantastic Oh Mummy from 1984, a game that's very much based on Amidar. While this game was originally made for the Amstrad CPC and was certainly a hit on that machine, Gem Software's Specky version was pretty popular too, and so it's definitely worth looking at. That and it's just really good. Much like in Amidar, you have to move around the grid and cover the lines around each rectangle while avoiding the enemies. Here you leave footprints to show where you've been. Rather than simply filling up each grid, the aim here is to find an ancient artifact and a key that leads you to the next tomb. There's also a scroll that grants you one free hit, as well as rectangles that will release another mummy into the maze, and naturally you get more points for filling up the rectangles and revealing treasure. It's quite the fun little arcade game, the sort that you'll happily have one more go on, and it's kind of stuck around for a long time. Hell, someone even made a homebrew version of the game for the Mega Drive a few years ago. Absolutely a great game. We did of course cover Daley Thompson's Decathlon in the last video, and even alluded to it earlier on. This was a breakthrough game for Ocean, one with a very nice licence attached, and it was quite the superb way to play track and field, all the events and all the joystick waggling goodness. This is quality. What's also interesting, mind you, is that Combat School did also get quite a few clones. Cause hey, people can't get enough of buying joysticks already. Of these clones, I've picked out Mastertronic's Raw Recruit as the top one for a few reasons. It's certainly got the gameplay that you would expect, with plenty of running around, exercising and shooting, and naturally you can do it all with 2 players. But it does have another ace up its sleeve. It is a software creations game, and you know what that means. Ah yes, just listen to that glorious, otherworldly sound, on a freaking 48K no less. Yes, Tim Follin was a god amongst men. Quite frankly, this alone is enough to put Raw Recruit ahead of the official Combat School port, but it's a decent waggle fest all the same. Lastly in this section, we have a couple of Gradius clones. We'll certainly be wanting one of these, seeing as the official port is so rubbish. Indeed, it's not hard to find a better attempt at the classic shooter. Something like Transmuter by Codemasters may not necessarily be the best shmup, but it's got the Gradius formula, and even if it's a bit flawed, well, it's a budget title, and you only spent a couple of quid on it, as opposed to the full price official port, and for that it's very decent. But I really wanted to show off an obscure and actually excellent 1-8K title here, a game called F.I.R.E from 1988. This is something of an indie title, even at the time, made by a Czech studio called Fucksoft, consisting of just one man named František Fukler over the course of a couple of weeks. And this guy's really good, because just look at this awesome game. This is absolutely the best Gradius clone you're going to get on the Specky, certainly from the commercial period. It's short, but there's plenty of cool sprites and sound, and an excellent title music track to start things off. Definitely a game that you should seek out and have a go on. As a review of the time would most likely say, it's a total blast. So we only have a couple more games to go through. Between Ocean and Konami themselves, they very much hoovered up the lion's share of games here. You may well be surprised to find, for example, that US Gold haven't featured at all in this video. Generally speaking, US Gold and Ocean divvied up the big arcade companies between them, meaning that, for example, the Birmingham lot would handle Capcom and Sega, while the Manchester folks got Konami, SNK and Taito. They were big enough to be able to do this for the most part, but there does still exist a couple of outliers. one from The Edge, and 2 from Mirrorsoft that represent the last duo of Konami games on the Spectrum. So let's finish up and quickly run through them. The infamous Edge Software House, yes, the very same one responsible for all those name-related lawsuits, made a port of Shao-Lin's Road in 1986 that's not too much more than a perfectly average conversion of a perfectly normal and simple arcade beat-em-up, multiple levels and all. It's a fine enough effort. You go around and kick various enemies to death, avoiding their attacks that will send you a bit dizzy. It's certainly not the best game that we've seen, but it's better than the version of Alien Syndrome that we saw from them in the Sega video at least. So, yeah, may as well just move on. The last duo are definitely more interesting, seeing as it's an arcade and also a license. We have Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles 1 and 2, meaning both the NES game and the arcade game. As mentioned in the previous video all about Ocean licenses, Ocean had very much sought after the license for the heroes in a half shell. However, they couldn't rekindle the flames of their relationship with Konami, and the Japanese studio went to Mirrorsoft instead. Robert Maxwell's boys, and a studio that was certainly looking to aim big around the end of the 1980s. These games were both released through the Imageworks label, and they were both handled by Probe Software. Seeing as Probe also worked with Ocean a fair bit, there is a decent chance that the games would have ended up the same if Ocean had the license. The first one is actually not too bad. It's rare to see a conversion from the NES to the Spectrum, and this was handled by the celebrated duo of David Perry and Nick Bruti. Perry and Bruti do the game in their usual style. You get big, colourful and very impressive graphics, and the gameplay actually isn't too bad either. The game is cut down quite a bit to fit on the 48K Spectrum, but most of the things people know are here. Yes, including the infamous dam level. While the game itself tends to get a mixed reception, this port is fine enough. Unlike the PC version, you can actually complete it for a start. I quite enjoy it on the whole. The second one, for the coin-op, well, this is obviously one where things get a bit over-ambitious. This is as close as we get to a noble yet ultimately doomed effort along the lines of US Gold's Final Fight. Try as Probe might, this game is very much not a goer on the Spectrum. Even if the sprites don't look too shabby, everything's very janky on the control front, and the game is really irritating. The sort of beat 'em up where it's easy to die very quickly because even the few graces you get in the arcade, such as iframes and what have you, are totally missing. The multi-load in this one is particularly irritating too. You spent more time waiting for stages to load up than you did playing. On the whole, you can see why they would bother to make a version of this for the Spectrum as it was such a huge game, but it's not a good one. It's also the last game that Imageworks, and indeed Mirrorsoft, would ever release. Not long after its release, Robert Maxwell did his mysterious trip off a yacht, make of it what you will, and the whole empire crumbled. Unfortunately, chances are pretty good that Probe didn't get any compensation at all for their efforts here because of that event. And with that, we're finished with this video. There are a couple of other games worthy of note from the Spectrum's Second Life, more modern affairs such as Nightmare or Castlevania Spectral Interlude, but I like to keep these videos largely to the commercial life of the system, and such games might be best covered another time. Generally, we've seen a pretty good standard of titles here. While they've not all been winners, we've seen some of the computer's best arcade ports in this video. Indeed, the only time that the level of the games really went through the floor was when Konami tried to handle it all by themselves, which certainly says something about the arcade port slinners like Imagine and the quality of work they tended to produce. Hopefully you've enjoyed looking at all of these titles, and as ever, all that's left for me to say is, bye for now.